Hi guys, welcome to this live. Welcome to this latest update on the interstellar object 3I Atlas. And we have rather wondrously Professor Avi Loeb from Harvard University joining us for our latest update. And we are only 6 days away from 3I Atlas's closest approach to Earth. Hi, Avi, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. No, thank you for taking the time. So when we last spoke, I think we were waiting expectantly for NASA's sort of images that they seem to have been holding on for a while, and then we were shown something that was deeply sort of disappointing. Can I first get your response to NASA's publication of this?
Yeah, well, it's quite unfortunate because it could have been the best image we have, but there was some jitter to the camera, and as a result, we got a fuzzy image. But
Yes.
gratefully, since then, we got a Hubble Space Telescope image that is actually, as expected, an excellent image with a 50 kilometers per pixel resolution. So that's really the best image because 3I Atlas was twice as close as it was when the previous Hubble image was taken on the 21st of July. So previously we got about 100 kilometers per pixel, now 50, and it's comparable to what the high-rise image was supposed to be. The high-rise camera is on board the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. By the way, the NASA press conference showed other images, one from the MAVEN spacecraft, which has an ultraviolet spectrograph, and they used it to figure out that there is hydrogen around the 3I Atlas. They took an image, and a couple of months later, MAVEN stopped working. So right now, they get no communication signal from MAVEN as of a week and a half ago, and they're trying to solve the problem, but basically we don't know the whereabouts of MAVEN, which is a very strange situation given that it was operating for 11 years around Mars. But if I were at the leadership of NASA, I would schedule a press conference after the Hubble image, because that's something to be proud of. Instead, they showed us a bunch of fuzzy images, no new information. At the same time, amateur astronomers provided much more informative images of 3I Atlas with instruments that cost only a few $1,000s. So you ask the question, why would they do that? And also, they didn't include any scientists that are actively analyzing data from NASA observatories, and instead they had officials providing us with the official answer and verdict that this is an object just like all others that we've seen in the solar system, all the comets, except it just came from another environment. Well, that's a bit disappointing because there are lots of anomalies about this object we don't fully understand. I wrote, for example, 3 papers on one of the anomalies, which is the anti-tail. And the Hubble image shows that there is a glow, a jet extending from the object towards the sun rather than away from the sun the way we see around comets. So to me, it's an anomaly. Now, of course, we see every now and then an optical illusion of some jets or tails that are extended away from the sun, and just because of the viewing angle, it looks as if they're pointing towards the sun. This is not the case, because we saw it all the way when the object was very far away from the sun. The first Hubble image already illustrated that there is an extension in the direction of the sun. There was no confusion there for viewing angle perspective. We saw it approaching us, and it was extended towards the sun. Now we see it receding from the sun, and again we see this anti-tail towards the sun, and it basically flipped relative to the direction of motion as the object passed closest to the sun on October 29th. So there is no doubt that there is an anti-tail, and it is an unusual phenomena. And why would all the people say, oh yeah, we've seen it sometimes before in the case of some perspective? There is no perspective here. There is a physical phenomena of an anti-tail. We need to explain it. I had an interesting anecdote. I wrote the 3rd paper just about a week ago, and tried to explain the anti-tail in a different way than I explained in the previous 2 papers. And so I submitted it for publication. Then the editor writes to me and says, this is a phenomena that was attempted, in the past, that people tried to explain it. Therefore, I decline, the publication of your paper because this is not new. So I wrote back to the editor and said, what do you mean by that? I wrote the previous 2 papers that explained it in a different way, and these are the only papers trying to explain it. It's not as if there is something in the literature that is magical. It's me that co-authored those papers trying to explain it, and now you're rejecting my paper because I wrote already a different explanation. So the following day, the paper was accepted for publication with the reference of my previous papers. And just to show you how people respond, people who call themselves professionals, experts, the editor should have read my papers before commenting on the fact that it was discussed before.
I mean, we have discussed on a couple of occasions, actually, the fact that there's this sort of dogmatic approach to science. The NASA press conference very much felt it was about trying to tell us all the things about the interstellar object 3I Atlas that concurred with a comet. And one of those was almost, they were saying, the fact that it moves through space. Well, there you go, we can call it a comet. Whereas actually, you're quite right. They avoided and didn't tackle any of the anomalies.
Yeah, and just imagine a cloud of dust being raised. You might say, okay, that's definitely an animal because natural animals produce a cloud of dust when they move through, through a dusty area. But the same is true for a car. The car would raise the same. You can't argue that just because you see a cloud of gas and dust, it must be a natural object, because a spacecraft could accumulate ices and dust as it moves through interstellar space for the same reason that a rock does it. As it forms, it accumulates all these materials. So who knows what the spacecraft went through, and if there is a layer, a skin of the spacecraft that was that included some ices from the journey that took billions of years, that would evaporate as soon as it gets close to the sun. That's not an argument that it must be a natural object. Also, the fact that it responds to gravity, is that a signature of it being a comet? I mean, what do you mean by walk like a comet? By that they mean it responds to gravity. Well, guess what? Every object responds to gravity. And moreover, there was evidence for non-gravitational acceleration. And you might say, okay, some comets do show that. Of course, there are many spacecraft also show non-gravitational acceleration. So you can't just say it walks like a comet, it looks like a comet, it must be this is very superficial. That's something that a bureaucrat and an official would say, but someone who knows the details, has to address the anomalies. And that's the way science is done. And I just don't understand why they would approach it this way, because obviously it would make the public much more interested in the subject if you were to tell the public there are some issues we cannot resolve, which is the truth. We want to figure it out. We will collect more data. Most likely it's a comet. That's a fair assessment. Most likely, I completely agree. That's what I said all the time. But you should always allow for surprises, allow for the need to learn something new. As I say, science is founded on the humility to learn, not on the arrogance of expertise. And what we saw in that press conference is the arrogance of expertise.
I totally agree. Has any sort of data, anything come through from various images from amateur astronomers, professional astronomers? Has anything come through since we last spoke about 2 weeks ago? That lessens the idea that it could be artificial, or suggests more that it could be a comet, simply a comet?
Well, there was new data on various fronts. It's not indicative of one or the other, but for example, there was methanol detected with much less hydrogen cyanide, a very extreme ratio of methanol to hydrogen cyanide. Now, methanol is a building block of life. Hydrogen cyanide in large quantities is a poison. It was actually used as a chemical weapon during the First World War by the US, Italy, and France. And so if you ask whether we are dealing with a friendly gardener from interstellar space or a serial killer, the verdict, according to the methanol to hydrogen cyanide ratio, is that it's most likely a friendly gardener, because it spreads the building blocks of life. Okay, because the other thing that was discovered is X-ray emission from the glow of gas around it. That is not surprising. It's basically the bombardment of the cloud of gas around 3I Atlas by the solar wind. And that was the first discovered by a Japanese satellite called the X-RISM. And then just a couple of days ago, there was a report from the European Space Agency, the XMM Newton satellite that discovered also X-ray emission. But the Japanese data is of higher quality because they have a spectrum that indicates which elements are being are emitting the radiation, the X-ray radiation that we see. Finally, of course, there was this Hubble image that indicated now from a closer perspective, indicated an anti-tail towards the sun, and it can be used in principle to constrain the size of the nucleus of 3I Atlas better than before. But what I'm mostly waiting for is data from the Webb telescope and ground-based telescopes that would allow us to measure the speed of the jets coming from the object, because a natural jet that is resulting from the sublimation of pockets of ice on the surface of a rock by the illumination of sunlight, those should have a speed of order hundreds of meters per second or slower, whereas anything technological is at least 1 to 2 orders of magnitude faster.
Right.
In chemical propulsion or ion thrusters, that's what we get. So we can tell if these jets are powered by a natural process or maybe technological one.
I mean, I've read in places that possibility, the idea of like little pockets that, I mean, to me, not being a scientist, that sort of the pressure creates a sort of expulsion of air. And I've also read in some places the suggestion that there could be mini volcanoes or volcanic aspects to this rock, if it is a comet. Is that
usually volcanism occurs as a result of an internal energy source like radioactive heating, and there is no reason to believe in such a small object that you would have that. It's the main source of energy is the heat from the sunlight, unless there is a central engine. And the other thing that was noticed is that the Gemini North telescope in Hawaii detected the color of the object after it passed closest to the sun. They just released the data a day ago, and it looks green. And the previous image they took in August was that of a red object. And so there was a change in the composition of the gas coming out of it as it came closest to the sun.
Would that indicate a more natural sort of origin?
So we don't know, because there is no spectrum. The spectrum usually can help figure out what is responsible for the color. And actually, when it came closest to the sun, there was a claim that it's blue. Now, if we had the spectrum, we could tell which molecule or atom are responsible for that color, or we can tell whether it's coming from a hot surface, because blue, is usually hotter. So they said it's bluer than the sun when it came closest to the sun, and that would mean there is a hot surface that it cannot be accommodated by nature, because the sun is very hot, and by a factor of 20 than the temperature of an object at that distance from the sun, unless there is an engine. But if it's not a temperature effect, if it's more to do with a molecule or an atom emitting this light, then we can figure it out from the spectrum.
Has it changed in size from any of the images you've been analyzing as it's getting closer? I mean, one of the weirdest things I've noticed, I don't know if you felt this, is almost as it gets closer, I felt there's been less, not revelations per se, but kind of less detail necessarily coming through. I still feel I feel like all the best is still to come. Is that true?
Yes, it is true. And there is you're right, that we haven't heard as much as we could have by now. Yeah. But it's partly, my guess is people are getting a lot of data. What I'd like to see is not amateur astronomer data, which comes out immediately, but from the bigger telescopes that we have access to. There are hundreds of them. And so people, I think groups are assembling the data. It's just that it takes time for them to put it together into a paper and then put it publicly. And many of the groups would prefer to go through peer review before they actually show the data. For one reason or another, they're very careful. They don't want to take risks, especially when there is so much interest in it. So what they're doing is they have the data, they wrote the paper already, and they're hiding it from the public eye until the paper will be accepted for publication. I mean, that's unfortunate because it may take a month or two and sometimes 3 months before that will happen. So all in all, I think there would be a lot of data collected during December, but we might not see it until February, March. That's when 3i Atlas will come closest to Jupiter. And that's another milestone, because what would be most interesting is to see whether anything unusual happens near Jupiter, because it comes exactly at the distance where Jupiter's gravity dominates over the sun's gravity, which is an unusual anomaly by itself.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that, because I think one of the non-gravitational kind of tugs or pulls on it knocked it into alignment with Jupiter, didn't it, in a certain way? Was that one?
Right.
Of
Yeah, but it's still being debated as to how much non-gravitational acceleration it acquired. The original report that came from the JPL Horizons monitoring of 3i Atlas was brought down actually by a factor of 40, a huge reduction in the level of non-gravitational acceleration that was originally reported by the same website. And there was even a paper just published that claimed a very different value than the JPL Horizons. I immediately connected the authors of the paper with the person who works at JPL that is compiling the data over there, because the two results were incompatible at more than 15 standard deviations. So it's clear. I said to them, one of you is wrong, or both of you are wrong. And so right now, it's still being decided as to what is the non-gravitational acceleration. And I have my own team working on that. We're trying to be careful, so we're waiting a little more. And just because it's challenging, the main challenge is that when you find the position of 3i Atlas, usually you have to figure out within the glow around it, where is exactly the brightest pixel, where is the nucleus of the object. And there is an effect of seeing. If your visibility is not great, then the image is degraded. And also the telescope has a point spread function that degrades the image. So altogether, deciding where is the object itself is quite challenging. And the question is how much uncertainty you assign to that assessment. And if you assign an uncertainty of order an arc second to all the assessments made by ground-based telescopes, which is one possibility, then you end up with just an upper limit on the non-gravitational acceleration, not the detection. However, some people are more optimistic. Then they report about results, and it's not clear how robust these results are. And as I said, there are two results that are contradictory right now.
So this could be an object that was interested in Mars, did something there, knocked out the Maven. It's passing us. It could be interested in us. It could deliver a wee little Christmas present around the 19th, but could ultimately be interested in Jupiter, perhaps. And it does sound like a reconnaissance mission of sorts, if you ask me.
Well, that was my original suspicion. That's why I said we should monitor it, because it came in the plane of the planets around the sun to within 5 degrees, and it's also coming close to Jupiter in this way, at a very specific distance from it, which happens to be the distance where you usually deposit devices so that they stay there without the need to maneuver much. So these are the Lagrange points where, for example, the Webb telescope is located at the second Lagrange point near the Earth relative to the sun. I think once it comes close to Jupiter, we can check if there are any objects right now, at the Lagrange points after it passes. And, before it came, there was definitely no object there. So anything new happening near Jupiter or Mars, I should say, because, who knows why Maven disappeared. I mean, it's worth checking, I would argue. And near Earth as well, because if it is technological, it would not maneuver. It's such a giant object that it takes a lot of fuel for it to actually do something. But it's much easier for it to deposit smaller objects that are not easy for us to detect. But once they arrive close to a planet, all the observatories that are neighboring the planet can potentially find those objects. And so we should check it, and maybe at the end of the day we won't find anything, and everything will signal that the object was indeed natural. Then okay, well, we learned something about a rare and unusual rock. Yes. And we just have to wait for the next one to come.
Has anything made you shift your scale of 4 yet? Are you still sat at 4 on the LOEB scale?
Well, I'm waiting for the additional data to be released in the coming weeks, because it makes no sense for me to update my verdict based on the past data. Since we're so close to getting much better data, let's just see what it means. And once that data is out, then I will tell you what I think.
And I just wanted to discuss quickly, you mentioned, I saw a paper come through where there was discussion of the antitail. Could there be a sort of swarm of small objects in front of it?
That was my most recent paper, the one that I mentioned before, that I submitted for publication just a week ago. And in that paper, basically, I suggested that perhaps this extension of the glow towards the sun around 3I Atlas is a result of the fact that there is some push of 3I Atlas away from the sun. This is the non-gravitational acceleration. But if it doesn't act on the objects, the other objects around it, and let's assume there are a lot of them, let's say 1 trillion of them, because there are so many small objects, they have more surface area altogether, by at least a factor of 100, let's say. So they reflect 99% of the sunlight, and 3I Atlas reflects only 1% of the sunlight that we see from the entire glow. And just because even though they carry, let's say, less than 1% of the mass, they could still, because there are lots of small fragments, they can still dominate the amount of surface that is exposed to sunlight. And so if the object is being pushed away from the sun, irrespective of what is the reason for that, if that's the non-gravitational acceleration, I just took the value that was reported by JPL Horizons, the latest value from the beginning of December, and I found that it will be separated from this swarm of objects by exactly the amount that we see in terms of the length of this anti-tail. So my point was that if there is a swarm of smaller objects, they will lag behind the big object if it gets away from the sun faster than gravity allows it. And in that case, we would see an anti-tail. So that was my explanation. This coincidence between the non-gravitational acceleration and which matches exactly the length of the anti-tail that you would get from these small objects lagging behind the big object. The other explanation that I had before was to say, well, maybe there are fragments of ice coming out of 3I Atlas, and those fragments of ice get evaporated before they have a chance to be pushed away from the sun. And so that was the other idea for the anti-tail.
Just finally, what was I've read stories of the sort of almost a pulse, the regular heartbeat pulse.
Yes. So that was an essay that I wrote. I didn't translate it to a paper because it's relatively straightforward. But the idea is that there was a report about a 16-hour periodicity in the reflection of sunlight by 3I Atlas, and so the claim of the authors was maybe the object itself is like football shaped. It's elongated, so as it rotates every 16 hours, you see a variation of the amount of light reflected from its solid surface. And I said that cannot be the case because the variation was the level of 20% or so, or 30%. And I said, the nucleus, according to the Hubble image from July 21st, the nucleus was responsible. It was the brightest pixel in the Hubble image. It was responsible for just 1% of the total amount of light. So you can't get a variation of 20, 30% from the nucleus spinning. It's contributing only 1%. So my point was that there must be jets coming from the object, and these jets are pulsating. So, for example, if you have, in the context of a natural object, if you have a pocket of ice, whenever it comes in the direction of the sun, whenever it's facing the sun, it will get sublimated and you'll get a jet coming out. And then once it gets to the night side, the opposite side, it's not getting vaporized, so it stops ejecting. So you will get pulsations of the jet, and it's sort of like a heartbeat, except that instead of the blood being pumped into the body, here you have dust and gas being pumped into the plume of gas around the object by the jets that are periodic. But you could also have a cycle that is dictated by some technology that has the same period. So at any event, what I suggested is that these heartbeat variations are not related to the shape of the object, but more related to the fact that the jets coming from it must be pulsating.
Right. I mean, just in final summary, so as we go into these 6 days before it's closest to Earth, our closest encounter, if you like, with it, what should we expect? I'm sure most sort of, sort of civilians, for want of a better expression, will be thinking, oh my God, should we look skyward? Is there going to be something happening? Are we going to notice a change? But what can we expect from the next 6 days?
Right. So, I mean, it's actually an amazing coincidence that December 19th, when 3I Atlas will come within 270 million kilometers from Earth, the closest, is exactly the new moon date. So the night sky will not be contaminated by moonlight. And wow. You can, in principle, if you want to see it, just buy a telescope with an aperture bigger than 20 centimeters, the palm of your open hand, so just buy a telescope like that, and you're able to monitor it, and it should appear green now and not red, and just check it out, and it should be a beautiful view as long as there are no clouds in the sky. As to how much more we will learn from it, that depends on the data coming from big telescopes that are used. And I very much look forward to the data from the largest telescopes on Earth on that date or around that date. I think they will have the best angular resolution. The object will appear brightest ever for two reasons. One is that it's closest to us. And the second reason is that it's after it came close to the sun. So, if it's a natural object, the amount of evaporation should be largest right now compared to the previous epochs that we could look at it. Unfortunately, it came closest to the sun when it was probably the brightest, only when the sun was between us and the object. So we couldn't look at it. Telescopes on Earth can only look at it when it's 30 degrees away from the sun. In the case of X-ray telescopes, it's actually 60 degrees away from the sun. That's why the data is flowing now and not. Yes. It wasn't available during October and the first half of November from most telescopes, and perhaps that is also part of the reason why we haven't heard a lot of news. But I suspect that during December there would be a huge amount of data collected, and then just wait for that after the holidays, and let's see what happens. And just hope that we will not get any unwanted gifts for the holidays.
I am hoping that. You see, for me, just in summary, for me, the fact that it went round the sun or went behind the sun, it came out, it didn't fall apart. It's held such a steady course. Every one of your anomalies for me still needs to be attended to. And and as it potentially heads towards Jupiter, you stress it hasn't changed in size, so we've had no sort of sublimation or.
We don't have a measurement of the size. I suspect that from the Hubble image, and in fact, I plan to analyze it in the coming week. We might be able to say something about the size from the brightest pixel, because this is the highest resolution image we have. So, the central pixel would be about 50 kilometers, and we can say, the object cannot be bigger than something, because otherwise that innermost pixels should have been brighter.
Yes. Well, thank you as ever for all of your work on this, and for ever encouraging everyone to keep an open mind and encouraging people to share. I genuinely hope we don't suddenly hear all of the information from all of the major telescopes and organizations in March next year, and we see photographs of small sort of green men waving at us then. It would be ridiculous.
Well, it's certainly green, but I would say, even if we miss the opportunity, but we realize after the fact that it was really not natural. This would be a very important teaching moment for humanity, because the next one coming around will obviously be scrutinized much more. And altogether, you know, my hope is that it will bring us to a better place, where curiosity will drive us to recognize that we have a neighbor, and that's not bad news. That's good news if that's the case, because you know that the neighbor might be more accomplished than we are, because they reached our backyard before we reached their backyard. So my hope is it will be inspiring for humanity. So that's why I'm doing, you know, in a way, I'm an optimist, and I believe that life is sometimes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you don't seek the evidence, you will never find it.
Thank you so much on that note. Thank you, Professor. And we may well be talking to you again once it's gone flying on its way to Jupiter. But thank you so much. Thank you.
Happy holidays.
And to you. Take care. Thank you. And thank you, everyone. I hope that was of note. Perhaps get yourself a telescope now, and you could actually see it on the 19th of December. But thanks, guys. And thank you, Avi. Thank you so much. And speak soon.